It was December 1992 in Moston, a suburb of Manchester, when one of the most shocking and sadistic crimes in Britain's modern history began to unfold. The victim was Suzanne Capper, a shy and vulnerable 16-year-old girl who had drifted away from her family and school, looking for belonging in the wrong company. What she found instead was a nightmare that would last 7 days of unimaginable cruelty, violence, and torment before her young life was extinguished. Suzanne wasn't the kind of teenager who stood out. People described her as quiet, gentle, and someone who struggled to fit in. She came from a fractured home life, bouncing between relatives, foster care, and her mother's unstable living situation. By 1992, she found herself spending more and more time at a house on Langworthy Road. This house wasn't a safe place. It was the home of 26-year-old Jean Powell, and it would soon become Suzanne's prison of pain. Jean Powell lived in chaos. Her home was filthy, crawling with lice and filled with clutter. But despite the mess, it was a gathering spot. She lived with her 3 children, and often had people drifting in and out. Among them were her ex-husband, Glenn Powell, 29 years old, Bernadette McNeely, a volatile 24-year-old mother of 4, Jeffrey Lee, a 26-year-old petty criminal, and Anthony Dudson, just 17, but already deep into crime and drugs. Together, these people formed a toxic, dangerous circle, feeding each other's cruelty and paranoia. Suzanne looked up to some of them, particularly Jean Powell. She wanted acceptance, and at first, she thought she had found friends there. But behind their doors lurked jealousy, resentment, and sadism. They didn't see Suzanne as one of them. They saw her as weak, as someone they could control, abuse, and eventually destroy. The events that led to Suzanne's abduction were as senseless as they were cruel. Jean Powell had accused Suzanne of passing on her head lice to others. Bernadette McNeely, unpredictable and violent, believed Suzanne had stolen her pink coat. Petty grievances, whispers of betrayal, and exaggerated grudges boiled over into something far darker. Instead of letting go of their resentment, this group of adults and teens plotted punishment. What Suzanne would endure went far beyond punishment. It was calculated torture. Stripped of humanity, on December 7, 1992, Suzanne was lured to Jean Powell's house. She trusted them, so she came willingly, unaware of the horrors that awaited her the moment she stepped inside. The trap was sprung, the door locked, and her nightmare began. She was immediately beaten and slapped. The group shaved her head, mocking her appearance. She was forced to listen to loud music at all hours, denied sleep, and stripped of dignity. Over the days that followed, her captors grew more inventive and sadistic. They tied her to furniture, forced her to take cold baths, and burned her repeatedly with cigarettes. She was injected with amphetamines against her will, making her even weaker and more disoriented. They taunted her constantly, laughing at her pain, mocking her screams. At one point, they forced her to listen to the song "Hi, I'm Chuck, You Wanna Play" from the Child's Play movies over and over again. It became a sick soundtrack to her suffering, a way for them to dehumanize her further. They called her Chucky as if she were a character in their twisted game. Suzanne's torture wasn't just physical, it was psychological warfare. They isolated her from any hope of rescue, convincing her no one cared, that no one was coming to save her. Each day that passed, her body grew weaker, her will tested, yet she clung to life, enduring what no human being should ever have to. By December 14th, after 7 days of torture, her captors decided it was time to end things. But even her murder was carried out with a cruelty that shocks to this day. They drove her to a remote area near Stockport under the guise of releasing her. Instead, they doused her in petrol and set her on fire. Suzanne, engulfed in flames, staggered through the field, screaming in agony, until she collapsed. Miraculously, she was still alive when a passing motorist found her. Her body was covered in 80 to 90% burns. Despite the unimaginable pain, she managed to speak to rescuers, telling them what had happened. She named her attackers, giving police the critical evidence that would later bring them to justice. Suzanne clung to life for more days in the hospital, but the injuries were too severe. On December 18, 1992, Suzanne Capper died. She was just 16 years old. The case shocked Britain. The brutality, the senselessness, the inhumanity, it was beyond comprehension. How could people, including a teenager, conspire and carry out such prolonged torture on a defenseless girl? The nation demanded answers. And soon, the trial of Suzanne's killers would reveal the disturbing details of her final days. But the trial was not just about facts, it was about the faces of the killers, the people who had stripped Suzanne of her life. Jane Powell, the supposed ringleader; Bernadette McNeely, the sadistic enforcer; Glenn Powell, her ex-husband, who played his part in the abuse; Jeffrey Lee, who joined in the violence; and the youngest, Anthony Dudson, who was just 17 yet took part with shocking enthusiasm. Together, they left a wound on Britain's conscience that would never fully heal. This was not simply a murder, it was prolonged, orchestrated torture, carried out in a residential neighborhood, where neighbors heard screams but dismissed them, where social services, schools, and family were too far removed to protect her. Suzanne's case raised haunting questions about how a vulnerable girl could fall through every crack, only to end in such tragedy. Suzanne's desperate fight for life after being set ablaze remains one of the most haunting aspects of her story. Despite the unbearable agony of her injuries, she somehow managed to survive long enough to find help. Barely clothed, her body almost entirely charred, she staggered for more than a quarter of a mile across the frosty Manchester field. Her skin was so badly burned that patches fell away as she moved. Yet she clung to one last thread of strength, driven by an instinct to live and to tell the world what had happened to her. A man on his way to work discovered Suzanne in this unimaginable state. At first, he could hardly believe she was alive. But when he realized, he rushed to her aid and called for help. Paramedics arrived quickly, shocked at the extent of her injuries. With burns covering over 80% of her body, they knew survival was nearly impossible. But Suzanne had one last purpose to fulfill. With the little breath she had left, she whispered the names of her tormentors. She named every one of them, ensuring the people responsible for her suffering would not escape justice. At the hospital, doctors worked frantically to save her, but they knew from the beginning the odds were stacked against her. Suzanne's pain was so severe that she drifted in and out of consciousness. When police tried to question her further, she struggled to form words, her body giving out from the trauma. Yet the courage she showed in those final hours was undeniable. Her testimony, fragile as it was, became the cornerstone of the case that followed. On December 18, 1992, after enduring the unendurable for a full 7 days, Suzanne Capper succumbed to her injuries. She was just 16 years old. News of her death spread rapidly across Manchester, and soon the entire United Kingdom was gripped by the horror of the crime. People asked the same questions over and over. How could such cruelty happen, and how could it go unnoticed for so long? The trial that followed revealed the disturbing details of Suzanne's torture in full. It was unlike anything the court or the public had ever heard before. The accused were Jane Powell, Glenn Powell, Bernadette McNeely, Clifford Pook, Anthony Dudson, and Jeffrey Lee. Each of them played a role in Suzanne's ordeal, and together, they created a nightmare beyond comprehension. Testimony revealed that Suzanne was lured into Powell's home under the guise of friendship, but once inside, she was treated as less than human. For days, she was beaten with planks, burned with cigarettes, injected with amphetamines against her will, and forced to endure psychological torment. McNeely, in particular, reveled in Suzanne's suffering, blasting loud music and forcing Suzanne to listen to recordings of her own screams. The cruelty seemed almost ritualistic, as if her tormentors fed off each other's brutality. One of the most chilling pieces of evidence presented in court was the way Suzanne's captors mocked her with pop culture references. They forced her to listen to the song High I'm Chucky, wanna play?" The catchphrase of the infamous horror movie doll. The taunt was repeated throughout her captivity, turning fiction into a grotesque reality. It demonstrated just how detached her captors had become from any sense of empathy or humanity. During the trial, witnesses described scenes that horrified even the most hardened legal professionals. The sheer sadism displayed made it clear that Suzanne's murder was not just a crime of impulse or anger, it was calculated cruelty, drawn out for 7 unbearable days. The youngest of the group, Anthony Dudson, was only 16, the same age as Suzanne, raising further questions about how someone so young could participate in such unimaginable acts. The jury's task was heavy, but the evidence was overwhelming. In 1993, the court found all 6 individuals guilty of their roles in Suzanne's torture and murder. The sentences varied. Jean Powell and Bernadette McNeely received life sentences, with minimum terms of 25 years, while others received lengthy terms reflecting their degree of involvement. Too many. The punishments did not feel sufficient for the horror inflicted, but the fact that Suzanne's killers were brought to justice offered some sense of closure to her grieving family. The case shook Britain to its core. It forced a reckoning with the darkest corners of human nature and the ways cruelty can fester behind closed doors. Newspapers called it Britain's most sadistic murder, and the name Suzanne Capper became forever linked to one of the nation's most harrowing true crime stories. To this day, Suzanne's story is remembered not only for the unbearable suffering she endured, but also for the strength she displayed in her final moments. Her ability to name her killers ensured that justice would be served, even if she would never see it herself. Her death became a tragic reminder of how vulnerable young people can be, and how communities must remain vigilant against cruelty hiding in plain sight. As you reflect on Suzanne's story, ask yourself, how could ordinary people descend into such monstrous behavior? What makes someone cross the line from cruelty to sadism? And what lessons can we learn to ensure something like this never happens again? If you found this story chilling, make sure to subscribe for more untold true crime and dark history stories. Share this with someone who needs to understand just how horrifying human cruelty can be, and let Suzanne's story never be forgotten.